This is apparently the way the ancient Hebrews would describe the universe. They thought of the earth as being this dry land, the area where people live. And over their heads is the firmament. It's translated the expanse by the NIV in accounts of creation in Genesis 1. But the word comes from a verb that means to hammer out a plate or to hammer out metal. And this is kind of a solid sheet of something over our heads, and it's supported by the mountains on either side. As the Hebrews looked around, they realized they were more or less surrounded by mountains, and thought of the sky being supported by mountains. And the sun and moon and stars are all kind of stuck on that sheet, on that solid firmament, although they slide around on it and they move in different configurations. And the firmament divides the waters above from the waters below. Water surrounds everything in the Hebrew cosmology. And these words represent chaos. It's Genesis 1:2, it's the deep. God shoves aside these waters and makes room for the earth and for the firmament. And you can see how this kind of view of the universe would account for the flood pretty easily. All God's got to do is open the windows of the firmament, and all he has to do is break up the fountains of the deep, and water collapses back in and destroys everything, kind of like a house with burst pipes. But underneath the earth, then, is a kind of cavern called, very cold, very dark, kind of a spooky place called Sheol. And this description makes a lot of sense for people who use their eyes alone to understand the world. If you were going to describe the universe just from your standpoint, using nothing but your eyes and no other kind of knowledge, you'd probably describe the world in much the same way as they did. Pedro Castaneda, who was one of Francisco Vázquez de Coronado's soldiers, was writing about the Llano Estacado. He got out here on this vast plain where there were no trees, there were no telephone poles, there were no fence posts, there were no roads, no house, nothing to give him any kind of perspective. And he said the sky is like a bowl turned upside down, so close you could almost reach out and touch it. And the Hebrew description of the universe is bowl-like. It's what you can see from horizon to horizon. Now we have, of course, improved our understanding of what the universe is like. From the time of Ptolemy in Egypt, who thought that the earth was the center of the universe and everything revolved around the earth, to the time of Copernicus, who believed that the sun was the center of the universe, to our own age. We use telescopes to peer far back out into the distance and far back in time. The universe is this vast array of stars emanating from a mysterious center, and you have galaxy upon galaxy just kind of whirling around and moving, times and distances that our minds have a hard time comprehending. Scientists call it deep time. I find it interesting to note, though, that as our way of seeing the universe has changed, and as our knowledge and technology and our perspective has changed, human beings have become smaller and smaller. More and more removed from the center of the universe until finally we are merely dust motes in space. For the Hebrews, their world was relatively small and familiar for the most part, and so God was right there, just right out there, almost close enough to touch, and human beings were his special creation, and so human beings had a proud central place in that universe. But for us, whose view of the world is almost infinite, no place is found for God, and human beings are just kind of an accidental combination of time and chemicals washed up on the beach of some forgotten sea on an insignificant world. We wind up with something like this: you are here. Now, maybe that's not a bad thing. As our knowledge and technology has grown and God has allowed us insight into the workings of his universe, it would really be easy for us to become full of pride about who we are. Here we are, the dust motes of the universe, but we're the only dust motes that ever learned to think, and we're the only ones who can really see how the world works. And look what we've done. Maybe kind of like the people in Genesis 11 who said, let's make a name for ourselves by building a tower up to heaven, and they thought they were so grand and so great. And Genesis 11:5 says, but the Lord came down to see the city, and to see the tower that the men were building. I mean, this great tower that they thought was so amazingly huge is something God had to stoop over and almost look at with a telescope himself. You know, it is so small. As our knowledge has grown and grown and grown, we've become smaller and smaller. Maybe that's a good way for God to keep us in our place and to remember that we are not on the order of the Creator. But there's another way of looking at the universe. We don't just live in a creation of dust and energy and light and time. We live in a spiritual universe. Not many of us have sat across from our wives at the dinner table and thought, wow, her molecules are really put together well. And we've not thought, I wonder which monkey in the zoo she's descended from. But all of us have sat there and we have thought, why does she love me so much? You see, we live in a spiritual universe. Those are the kinds of questions that are really important to us. That's really what separates human beings from animals, our awareness of this spiritual dimension. We have hopes and dreams and fears and aspirations, and we're energized by learning new things and frustrated and even hurt when we see human beings mistreated and living in squalor. And we love and we hate and we struggle with our emotions and with our morals. The Corinthians of the first century were struggling to be wise. They wanted to understand how the world works. You read 1 Corinthians and you kind of come away feeling negative about the Corinthians and about the way that they were doing things, but they were not just simply trying to get a diploma and the admiration of their neighbors. They really wanted to make right choices, and they wanted to make to be the right kind of people and raise the right kind of kids and do all the things that we want to. And so Paul, when he writes to them, says to them, here's what you have to remember above all. At the center of the universe is Christ crucified. He will say to them in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 20, where is the wise man? Where is the scholar? Where is the philosopher of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not know him, God was pleased through the foolishness of what was preached to save those who believe. Jews demand miraculous signs, and Greeks look for wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles, but to those whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. Now, it's not as though Paul were trying to be hostile to learning and research and study. That was kind of the reaction that the church had in the 3rd century to a lot of this stuff. But those types of things, Paul says, have their places and have their limits. What really matters is that you understand that right at the center of the world, the thing that makes us who we are is Jesus Christ crucified. Astronomers peer back in time when they look into space because of the limits on the speed of light as it travels through space. They can look very far back in time. They can look way, way back. And they have studied the way everything in the universe is expanding and have isolated the point from which all things originated. And sort of standing there in their imagination, they get glimpses of the blueprints that God used when he constructed this universe. And you may think that doesn't really matter, but a lot of the stuff that you enjoy nowadays comes from understandings that scientists have of what might have happened back there. The telephones you talk on, the cell phones you talk on are based on that kind of science. The computers you use, even the way metals and plastics are made. But if that's true, think about the important ideas that we learn when we understand and remember. Here are scientists thinking, okay, here we are at the center of the universe. This is the way the universe works. Think about how important it is for us as we think about the center of our spiritual universe, that for us, Christ crucified is right at the center of the universe. He is the one that is that understanding that causes us to be able to operate in this universe. Now, there are several things that fall out of this. First of all, the root problem of all human existence is sin. Paul will say, none of the rulers of this age understood what Christ was all about. For if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. Now, we define sin correctly, I think, as what I do because of my pride or my fear or my self-centeredness. Sin is the reason people are hooked on pornography. Sin is the reason that people destroy their lives with drugs. Sin is the reason that children are born with no fathers to care for them responsibly. And we could just go on down the list, of all of the things that have gone wrong in the world. Our understanding is not one of them went wrong for any other reason than because of sinfulness. That sin is in the world, sin is in people, in the actions of people, and sin just ruins the world. And if you dig down far enough, think about it. I mean, sin is the reason your husband drives you crazy. Sin is the reason that you pick fights with your wife. And sin is the reason you spend more than you have. And sin is the reason your kids are crazy. It's all of that kind of thing. You just dig down far enough, and you be open enough and honest enough, and you'll find sin right at the root of every human problem, large or small. Right at the center of the universe, then, is not the fact that sin is the root of everything, but the fact that Jesus is crucified. This injustice, this hatred, this fear, this blindness, this lust for power, all of that stuff that happens in this universe, all of those are centered, all of those have something to do with the fact, or at least, let me turn that around. Christ Jesus at the center of the world crucified has something to do with all of that stuff that has gone wrong. All of those things are absorbed, all of those things are represented by Christ on the cross. And secondly, the fact that Christ is at the center of the universe, the solution to sin is redemption. I started to say that the solution to sin is forgiveness, but that's not 100% true. Forgiveness is kind of a misleading term, the way that we use it. We kind of think of forgiveness as setting a person free with no consequences, or kind of like being a chump. When somebody wrongs you, you turn them loose and you just kind of absorb the problem that they have. Paul says in verse 30 of 1 Corinthians 1, "It is because of him that you're in Christ Jesus, who has become for us wisdom from God, that is righteousness, holiness, and redemption." Redemption is the concept that I've got in mind here. Jesus crucified. Redemption means that a price has been paid to overcome the effects of sin. Redemption is a word that comes out of slave societies. A slave has no hope of ever being free. He's just a slave. He will always be a slave. But then someone comes along and has mercy by buying him and setting him free, buying him so that he can be set free, so that now he can become someone he never was before. And that's what Christ does for us. He makes it possible for us to be what God created us to be. What we have never been before, we can be because of sin. Because of what we can never be because of sin, we can now be because of Christ crucified. Redemption is really a good word to use for the biblical concept of forgiveness. Sin blows up our lives, just shatters it, fractures it, disintegrates it, whatever you want to say, even in the most trivial cases. I mean, when I argue with my wife, I can use my wife as an example today because she's not here, she's ill, so. But when I argue with my wife, we don't just shrug and move on. Well, there was another fight, we just kind of go on. There is always that time when we dance around each other and we shoot each other looks and we growl and we grumble and we threaten. And I let her know in big and little ways that she's not my favorite person. And it kills her on the inside. Until one of us finally swallows the pain and says, "Look, I set you free. Let's be in love again." And then that open acceptance sets it up so that I can be sorry for what I've done and I can apologize and I can be right again. Here is Christ crucified, our redemption. He bore the pain of sin and he bore the rejection and destruction. God didn't merely just say, "Okay, I know you're sinners, you're just free. I just let it go." Sin causes pain and shame and fear. It causes that in both the person who is wronged and also in the one who does the wrong. So that it's not just my wife, when I'm mad at her, it's not just her that feels shame and fear, but I feel it too because I'm ashamed of myself and I'm afraid of what I've done and what I'm capable of. And if any of that is left with God, if anybody on either side still feels any of that pain, any of that shame, any of that fear, then our lives are still blown up. We still can't have that relationship. We're still kind of circling around one another, kind of negotiating and trying to fight through this business. That's why our response to God has to be faith. If we don't believe that all of the pain and shame and fear are gone in Christ, if we don't really trust God that all of that has been wiped away, then we still exist in our pain and in our shame and in our fear, and everything just kind of goes on like it was before. Christ on the cross, Christ Jesus has redeemed you. He has set you free to worship God and to be healthy in your love for Him. He set you free to pray to Him and expect Him to hear you and respond out of His love, and not out of some warped sense of pity, but out of His free love, because we are His and we are free with one another. He has set you free so that you can love the people you want to love, because you can admit when you're wrong and you can work on it without fear. You can truly be a different person because sin can be redeemed and you can be changed. You belong to Jesus. Paul will say to the Corinthians, so then, no more boasting about men. All things are yours, whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas or the world or life or death or the present or the future, all are yours. And you are of Christ, and Christ is of God. I read an article in the magazine Christian Family, and there was a high school senior who was talking about her basketball team. And she said, our basketball team was getting ready to play, and she said, I was just embarrassed to death by the filthy language and the filthy jokes that went on in the locker room. She said it continued even onto the court. And then she said, we gathered around half court and we recited the Lord's Prayer. Christ at the center, or Christ as an afterthought? See, that's what really gets us in trouble, is we think Christ is at the center when Christ is really just kind of an afterthought, someone looking on rather than being right at the center. Paul says, you are still worldly. He says to these Corinthians, you are still worldly. For since there is jealousy and quarreling among you, are you not worldly? Are you not acting like mere men? Christ crucified is the center of our universe. And that makes all the difference in our relation to God, in our relation to one another, in our relation to the world. We're going to stand and sing the invitation song. And if you need to come to Christ this morning, would you please